The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear one final time. The city had been quiet for 3 days, but everyone knew that silence in this place meant trouble was brewing. Her squad of 12 Marines was tasked with clearing a suspected weapons cache in the industrial district, a routine mission that should have taken no more than 2 hours. Sarah had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, and Fallujah had become as familiar to her as her hometown streets back in Ohio. She knew which corners offered the best cover, which buildings were likely to house snipers, and which sounds meant immediate danger. Her team trusted her completely. At 26, she had already survived more firefights than most soldiers see in their entire careers. The intelligence report was straightforward. Local informants had spotted insurgents moving heavy equipment into an abandoned textile factory on the eastern edge of the city. The building had been used as a staging area before, and coalition forces had cleared it twice in the past 6 months. This time, however, something felt different. The usual chatter on insurgent radio frequencies had gone silent, and the local population seemed more nervous than usual. As Sarah's squad moved through the narrow alleyways toward their target, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her point man, Corporal Johnson, signaled back that he had spotted movement in the upper floors of buildings ahead. The team took cover behind a concrete barrier that had been erected months earlier during another operation. Sarah radioed back to base, confirming their position and estimated time to target. Command responded with an update that made her blood run cold. Satellite imagery had detected unusual heat signatures in the area, suggesting a much larger insurgent presence than initially reported. What was supposed to be a simple weapons cache clearing had the potential to become something much more dangerous. The decision to proceed came from higher up the chain of command. Intelligence indicated that high-value targets might be present in the facility, making the mission too important to abort based on speculation. Sarah gathered her squad and briefed them on the new information. Despite the increased risk, none of her Marines suggested backing down. They had trained for exactly this type of situation. Moving forward, the team used a combination of stealth and speed to approach the target building. Sarah positioned her machine gunner and designated marksman in overwatch positions, while she led the entry team toward the main entrance. The plan was simple: breach, clear, and extract any intelligence or materials they found. If they encountered significant resistance, they would call for immediate backup and hold their position until reinforcements arrived. As they reached the final approach to the textile factory, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The building's windows, which should have been boarded up or broken from previous battles, were intact and appeared to have been recently cleaned. Fresh tire tracks in the sand led to a loading dock that intelligence reports had indicated was unused. These small details suggested that the insurgents were not only present, but had been preparing for exactly this type of raid. Sarah made the decision to adjust their entry point, choosing a side entrance that would give them better tactical advantage and multiple escape routes if needed. She divided her team into 2 fire teams, with herself leading the primary entry group while Sergeant Rodriguez took the secondary team to secure the rear of the building. The last communication she received from base before entering the building was a weather update. A sandstorm was approaching from the west and would reach their position within 3 hours. If the mission extended beyond that time frame, extraction would become significantly more difficult. Sarah acknowledged the information and gave the signal for her team to move into position. As they approached the entrance, Sarah could hear faint sounds coming from inside the building. Voices speaking in Arabic, the scrape of metal against concrete, and what sounded like equipment being moved. The insurgents were definitely inside, and based on the level of activity, there were more of them than her squad of 12 Marines was equipped to handle in a prolonged engagement. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and prepared to lead her team into what would become one of the most intense battles of the Iraq War. She had no way of knowing that within the next few hours, she would be fighting for her life with 14 bullet wounds while waiting for a SEAL team extraction that seemed impossible to achieve. Sarah's hand signal initiated the breach. Corporal Johnson placed the explosive charge on the door, while the rest of the entry team positioned themselves for immediate entry. The explosion echoed through the empty streets, and within seconds, Sarah was leading her Marines into the textile factory that would become their battlefield. The interior of the building was a maze of old machinery, fabric rolls and makeshift barriers that the insurgents had constructed to create defensive positions. Sarah's team moved with practiced precision, clearing each room systematically while maintaining constant communication. The first floor appeared empty, but the sound of footsteps above indicated that the real fight was waiting upstairs. As Sarah's primary team began ascending the concrete stairwell, the building erupted in gunfire. The insurgents had turned the second floor into a fortress, with overlapping fields of fire and prepared positions behind heavy machinery. The first burst of automatic weapons fire forced Sarah's team to take cover on the stairwell, but they were exposed and taking accurate fire from multiple directions. Sergeant Rodriguez's team, positioned at the rear of the building, reported that insurgents were attempting to escape through back exits. He requested permission to engage, but Sarah knew that splitting their forces further would leave both teams vulnerable. She made the decision to have Rodriguez hold his position and prevent any escape while she dealt with the main force upstairs. The stairwell became a death trap. Every time one of Sarah's Marines attempted to advance, they were met with a wall of bullets from above. Corporal Johnson took the first hit, a round that struck his shoulder and spun him against the concrete wall. Sarah immediately moved to his position, dragging him to cover while returning fire with her rifle. The insurgents had positioned themselves perfectly. They controlled the high ground, had multiple escape routes, and knew the building's layout better than the Marines. Sarah realized that a frontal assault would result in casualties her small team couldn't afford. She radioed for artillery support, but was informed that the building was too close to civilian structures to authorize heavy weapons. Sarah decided to use the insurgents' confidence against them. She ordered her team to fall back to the first floor, making it appear as though they were retreating. The insurgents took the bait, pursuing them down the stairwell in an attempt to finish off what they believed was a defeated Marine unit. This tactical error would prove to be their undoing. As the insurgents descended, they walked directly into Sarah's prepared ambush. Her Marines had positioned themselves behind concrete pillars and machinery on the ground floor, creating interlocking fields of fire that caught the pursuing fighters completely off guard. The engagement was brutal and decisive. Within minutes, 6 insurgents lay dead, and the remainder had retreated back upstairs. However, the victory came at a cost. In addition to Johnson's shoulder wound, 2 more Marines had been hit during the fighting. Lance Corporal Martinez had taken shrapnel from a grenade that exploded near his position, and Private First Class Thompson was bleeding from a head wound caused by concrete fragments. Sarah's squad was now down to 9 effective fighters, against an unknown number of insurgents who still controlled the upper floors. Sarah established a defensive perimeter on the ground floor and called for medical evacuation for her wounded Marines. The response from command was not what she wanted to hear. The approaching sandstorm had grounded all helicopter flights, and ground-based medevac was impossible due to the tactical situation. Her wounded would have to hold on until the weather cleared. The insurgents weren't finished fighting. They had regrouped upstairs and were preparing for another assault. Sarah could hear them moving equipment, likely setting up heavier weapons to use against her depleted force. She knew that staying in their current position would eventually result in being overrun, but advancing upstairs would be suicidal with her reduced numbers. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Rather than wait for the insurgents to dictate the terms of engagement, she would force them to come to her. She ordered her team to rig explosive charges throughout the ground floor, creating a kill zone that would devastate any force attempting to overrun their position. If the insurgents wanted to finish the fight, they would have to pay a terrible price. As her Marines prepared their defensive positions, Sarah received an update from Sergeant Rodriguez's team. They had spotted vehicles approaching the building from multiple directions. The insurgents weren't just defending a weapons cache. They were part of a larger operation, and reinforcements were arriving to ensure that no Marines left the building alive. Sarah looked at her watch and calculated the time until the sandstorm would hit. 2 hours and 15 minutes. In that time, she would have to hold off an unknown number of insurgents with a squad that was already reduced by casualties and dwindling ammunition. The situation had transformed from a routine mission into a desperate fight for survival, and Sarah knew that the next few hours would test every skill she had learned as a Marine. The sound of engines outside the textile factory confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Through the broken windows, She could see trucks unloading armed fighters who quickly took positions around the building. What had begun as a squad-level engagement was rapidly escalating into a company-sized battle, with her 12 Marines facing odds that grew worse by the minute. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent communications from command. Intelligence had identified the building as a meeting point for senior insurgent leaders, and the enemy's response indicated they were willing to sacrifice significant resources to protect whatever was inside. The mission parameters had changed completely, but extraction was still impossible due to the approaching sandstorm. Sergeant Rodriguez reported movement on all sides of the building. His count suggested at least 40 insurgents had surrounded their position, with more vehicles arriving every few minutes. Sarah realized that conventional defensive tactics would not be sufficient. She needed to create chaos and confusion to level the playing field against overwhelming numbers. Sarah divided her remaining effective Marines into 3 teams. One team would maintain the primary defensive position on the ground floor. Another would create diversionary attacks from different windows to confuse the enemy about their actual numbers and positions. And the third team would attempt to reach the second floor to establish overwatch positions. The first coordinated assault came 30 minutes later. Insurgents attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons to suppress the Marines while assault teams attempted to breach the building. Sarah's prepared explosives devastated the first wave of attackers, but the enemy quickly adapted their tactics. During the second assault, Sarah took her first wound. A bullet grazed her left arm as she moved between positions to direct her team's defense. The wound was minor, but it reminded her of how precarious their situation had become. Every Marine was essential to their survival, and any serious casualties could tip the balance decisively in favor of the insurgents. The insurgents began using a different strategy. Instead of direct assault, they established firing positions in surrounding buildings and began a systematic effort to suppress the Marines with continuous gunfire. This allowed their assault teams to advance closer to the building, while the Marines were forced to keep their heads down. Sarah recognized the danger immediately. If the insurgents succeeded in reaching the building walls, they could use explosives to breach the structure and eliminate the Marines' defensive advantages. She ordered Corporal Anderson to take 2 Marines and establish a sniper position on the second floor, despite the known presence of insurgents in that area. Anderson's team fought their way upstairs in a vicious close-quarters battle. The remaining insurgents on the second floor had barricaded themselves in the factory's old office spaces, creating a deadly maze of rooms and corridors. Anderson's team had to clear each space systematically, using grenades and coordinated assaults to dislodge defenders who fought with desperate determination. While Anderson's team battled upstairs, Sarah coordinated the ground floor defense against increasingly sophisticated attacks. The insurgents had brought heavy machine guns and were systematically destroying the Marines' cover. Concrete pillars that had provided protection were being chipped away by sustained gunfire, and several of Sarah's Marines reported that their positions were becoming untenable. The turning point came when Anderson's team successfully established their overwatch position. From the second-floor windows, they could engage insurgent firing positions in surrounding buildings and provide covering fire for the ground-floor defenders. The tactical advantage shifted enough to give Sarah's team breathing room to reorganize their defense. However, the insurgents adapted quickly. They began using smoke grenades to obscure Anderson's vision while assault teams moved closer to the building. Sarah realized that the enemy commander was experienced and professional, systematically probing for weaknesses in the Marine defense and adjusting tactics based on the results. Sarah received an update from command that made their situation even more desperate. The sandstorm was moving faster than predicted and would reach their position in less than 90 minutes. Once the storm hit, visibility would drop to near zero, and the insurgents could use the cover to overrun the building with overwhelming force. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own Marines. Instead of continuing to fight defensively, she announced plans for an offensive operation. She would take half of her effective fighters and attack one of the insurgent positions outside the building, creating enough chaos to disrupt their coordinated assault plans. The idea was tactically sound but extremely risky. Success would require perfect timing and execution. With no room for error, failure would likely result in the destruction of Sarah's entire team. As she prepared her Marines for what could be their final battle, Sarah couldn't know that this decision would ultimately save their lives and lead to one of the most remarkable survival stories of the Iraq War. Lance Corporal Martinez, despite his earlier wounds, volunteered to remain with the reduced defensive team. His knowledge of explosives would be crucial for creating diversionary blasts that would support Sarah's assault team. As Sarah checked her weapon and prepared to lead her Marines into the storm of gunfire outside, she wondered if any of them would survive the next hour. Sarah's assault team moved out of the textile factory under cover of Martinez's diversionary explosions. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: strike hard at the insurgent command position, create maximum confusion, then fall back to a more defensible location before the sandstorm arrived. What Sarah didn't anticipate was walking directly into a carefully planned ambush. The insurgents had positioned a heavy machine gun team in a location that provided overlapping fields of fire with their main positions. As Sarah led her 4 Marines across the open ground between buildings, the machine gun opened fire with devastating accuracy. Private First Class Williams, running beside Sarah, was hit in the chest and went down immediately. Sarah dove for cover behind a concrete barrier, but the machine gun position had been placed to eliminate exactly that type of protection. Bullets chipped away at the concrete, and she realized that her team was trapped in a kill zone with no escape route. The insurgents had anticipated her offensive move and prepared accordingly. Sergeant Rodriguez, monitoring the situation from his position at the rear of the building, made a crucial decision. Against orders, he left his post and moved to flank the machine gun position from an unexpected angle. His movement probably saved Sarah's life, but it left the building's rear entrance undefended. The machine gun crew never saw Rodriguez coming. His assault was swift and decisive, eliminating the crew with grenades and rifle fire. However, his heroic action came at a terrible personal cost. As he moved to signal Sarah's team that the position was clear, a sniper's bullet struck him in the leg, shattering his femur and leaving him unable to walk. Sarah's team was able to reach Rodriguez's position, but they now had 2 seriously wounded Marines and were farther from the relative safety of the textile factory than when they started. The insurgents had used their offensive action to draw them into an even more vulnerable position, and the sandstorm was less than an hour away. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years afterward. Unable to carry both wounded Marines and maintain any hope of reaching safety, she ordered her 2 remaining effective fighters to establish a defensive position while she attempted to get Rodriguez and Williams back to the building. The decision meant splitting her tiny force even further, but abandoning wounded Marines was not an option she could live with. The journey back to the textile factory became a nightmare of constant gunfire and desperate movement from cover to cover. Sarah dragged Rodriguez while Corporal Peterson carried Williams, both Marines firing their weapons one-handed while protecting their wounded comrades. The insurgents seemed to be everywhere, and each movement drew accurate fire from multiple directions. Halfway back to the building, Sarah took her second wound. A bullet struck her in the right thigh, causing her to stumble and fall. The impact sent waves of pain through her leg, but adrenaline kept her moving. She could feel blood soaking through her uniform. But stopping to treat the wound would mean death for all of them. Peterson took his first hit as they reached the final 100 meters to the building. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop Williams. For a moment it appeared that all 4 Marines would die in the open ground between their position and safety. But Martinez's explosives provided the distraction they needed. Martinez had been monitoring their approach and timed a series of explosions to coincide with their final dash to the building. The blasts forced the insurgents to take cover long enough for Sarah to drag all 3 wounded Marines through the entrance and back into their defensive perimeter. Once inside, Sarah assessed their situation with growing desperation. Of her original 12 Marines, 6 were now wounded to varying degrees and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The insurgents had used her offensive action to tighten their encirclement, and escape routes that might have existed earlier were now completely blocked. The sandstorm arrived earlier than predicted, turning the world outside into a brown, swirling hell of dust and wind. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, and the constant howl of wind made communication difficult. Sarah realized that while the storm would prevent insurgent reinforcements from arriving, it also meant that any hope of rescue or resupply was gone until the weather cleared. Anderson's Overwatch team reported that they could no longer see insurgent positions due to the storm, but the sound of movement outside indicated that the enemy was using the reduced visibility to move closer to the building. The final assault would come soon, and Sarah's depleted team would have to face it with limited ammunition and multiple casualties. Sarah gathered her remaining effective Marines and explained the situation with brutal honesty. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the insurgents would be in position for a final assault. Their ammunition would last for maybe 15 minutes of sustained fighting. There would be no rescue, no reinforcements, and no resupply until the storm passed, which could be hours away. As Sarah spoke, she took her third wound. A sniper's bullet, fired through the swirling dust, struck her in the left shoulder. The impact knocked her backward, and blood immediately began soaking her uniform. Looking at her wounded Marines and feeling the pain from her own injuries, Sarah made a promise that would define the next several hours of fighting. No matter what happened, no matter how many bullets she took, she would not let her Marines die in this forgotten building in Fallujah. The insurgents launched their final assault during the height of the sandstorm. Sarah could hear them moving through the swirling dust, coordinating their attack despite the limited visibility. With 3 wounds already affecting her mobility, she positioned herself at the most vulnerable point in their defensive perimeter, determined to hold the line until help arrived. The first wave hit their position with overwhelming force. Explosions rocked the building as rocket-propelled grenades detonated against the walls, and automatic weapons fire poured through every opening. Sarah's Marines responded with disciplined fire, making every shot count as their ammunition dwindled rapidly. The muzzle flashes in the dust-filled air created an otherworldly battlefield that none of them would ever forget. Sarah took her 4th wound during the initial exchange. A bullet fragment ricocheted off a concrete pillar and embedded itself in her right arm, but she continued directing her team's defense without pause. Anderson's overwatch position was taking heavy fire, and she could hear him calling for more ammunition. Martinez was down to his last few explosives, and their defensive perimeter was steadily shrinking. The insurgents had learned from their earlier failures and were using small teams to probe different sections of the building simultaneously. Sarah realized they were trying to identify the weakest point in the Marine defense before committing their main force. She began moving constantly between positions, reinforcing whichever section was under the heaviest pressure, taking additional wounds with each movement. Her 5th wound came as she moved to support Anderson's position. A sniper's bullet grazed her scalp, leaving a bloody furrow that temporarily disoriented her. The 6th wound followed minutes later when shrapnel from an exploding grenade tore through her left leg. Despite the mounting injuries, Sarah continued to fight with fierce determination, inspiring her Marines to maintain their defense against impossible odds. The battle's turning point came when Martinez made a heroic decision. With Sarah wounded and ammunition critically low, he rigged the building's remaining explosives as a massive booby trap. If the insurgents succeeded in overrunning their position, he would detonate the charges, taking as many enemies as possible with them and denying the insurgents their victory. Sarah took wounds 7 through 10 during a desperate hand-to-hand combat sequence when insurgents breached the ground floor. Fighting with her sidearm and knife, she engaged multiple attackers in close quarters while her wounded Marines provided covering fire from their positions. Each wound was a bullet or blade strike, but she continued fighting with a determination that seemed superhuman. Anderson's position finally became untenable, and he fought his way back to the ground floor with wounds of his own. The insurgents now controlled the 2nd floor and were preparing to assault the Marines' final defensive positions from above. Sarah realized that conventional tactics had failed, and only desperate measures could save her team. Sarah made a decision that would become legendary among Marine units. With 11 wounds limiting her mobility and effectiveness, she created a diversion that allowed her remaining Marines to reach Martinez's prepared explosive position. She drew insurgent attention to herself, moving through the building while firing her weapon and calling out challenges in broken Arabic. The tactic worked perfectly, but at a terrible cost. Sarah took wounds 12, 13, and 14 during her solo diversion, including a serious bullet wound to her abdomen that she knew could be fatal without immediate medical attention. However, her sacrifice allowed her Marines to reach the prepared explosive position where they could make a final stand. As Sarah collapsed behind cover, bleeding from 14 separate wounds, she managed to maintain radio contact with her team and coordinate their final defensive efforts. Her voice, weakened by blood loss and pain, still carried the authority and determination that had kept her Marines alive throughout the battle. She refused medical attention, insisting that the limited supplies be used on Marines who might still be saved. The insurgents, having seen their overwhelming assault repeatedly defeated by a handful of wounded Marines, began to lose their enthusiasm for the fight. The combination of mounting casualties, the ongoing sandstorm, and the unexpected resilience of the Marine defense had turned their certain victory into a costly and uncertain battle. Sarah's radio crackled with an impossible message. A Navy SEAL team, operating in the area when the storm hit, had detected the sound of sustained gunfire and was attempting to reach their position. The message was broken and difficult to understand through the storm's interference, but it offered the first hope Sarah's team had experienced in hours. However, the SEALs were still at least an hour away, fighting their own battle against the sandstorm and insurgent positions. Sarah, bleeding from 14 wounds and growing weaker by the minute, had to keep her Marines alive long enough for rescue to arrive. With her consciousness beginning to fade from blood loss, she prepared for what might be her final hour of command, determined that not a single Marine would die on her watch. Sarah's world had become a haze of pain and determination as she held her position, with 14 bullet wounds. Blood loss was making her dizzy, and she could feel her strength ebbing away with each passing minute. The radio communications with the approaching SEAL team were sporadic at best, broken up by the sandstorm's interference and the ongoing gunfire that echoed through the textile factory. The insurgents had regrouped for what appeared to be their final assault. Sarah could hear their commanders shouting orders in Arabic, coordinating an attack that would overwhelm the remaining Marine defenders through sheer numbers. Her own Marines were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and several were so badly wounded that they could barely return fire. Anderson crawled over to Sarah's position, his own wounds making movement difficult. He reported that Martinez was unconscious from blood loss, and Peterson was struggling to maintain his firing position due to his shoulder wound. The Marine defense was collapsing, held together only by Sarah's refusal to surrender and her continued leadership despite her critical injuries. Sarah made what she believed would be her final tactical decision. She ordered her Marines to fall back to Martinez's prepared explosive position, where they could make a last stand that would take as many insurgents as possible with them. If the SEAL team couldn't reach them in time, at least they would die as Marines, fighting to the end. The movement to their final position required Sarah to crawl across open ground, while insurgents fired at her from multiple directions. She took what would have been her 15th wound, but the bullet only grazed her helmet, leaving her conscious enough to continue directing her team's final preparations. Every breath was becoming more difficult, and she knew that her time was running out. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire outside the building changed character. Instead of the steady rhythm of insurgent weapons, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of American firearms engaging targets in a coordinated pattern. The SEAL team had arrived, and they were fighting their way toward the textile factory through the sandstorm and enemy positions. The insurgents, caught between the Marine defenders inside the building and the SEAL assault from outside, found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Their overwhelming numerical advantage became meaningless as they were forced to fight on two fronts while dealing with limited visibility from the ongoing sandstorm. Sarah's radio crackled with a clear transmission. The SEAL team leader was requesting her status and the location of her defensive position. Despite her wounds and weakness, Sarah managed to provide detailed information about her team's condition, the building layout, and the insurgent positions. Her professional competence, maintained even while critically wounded, impressed the SEAL operators who were fighting to reach her. The final minutes of the battle were a chaos of explosions, gunfire, and shouted commands as the SEAL team fought their way into the building. Sarah remained conscious long enough to identify her Marines to the rescuers and ensure that all wounded personnel were accounted for. Only after confirming that every one of her Marines was receiving medical attention did she allow herself to lose consciousness. The medical evacuation was complicated by the ongoing sandstorm, but the SEAL team's medics stabilized Sarah and her wounded Marines for transport. The helicopter extraction required exceptional flying skills to navigate through the dust and wind, but all of Sarah's Marines survived the journey to the field hospital. Her decision to hold their position rather than attempt a fighting withdrawal had ultimately saved their lives. Sarah spent 3 weeks in critical condition at a military hospital in Germany. Her 14 wounds required multiple surgeries, and doctors later said that her survival was largely due to her physical fitness and mental determination to keep fighting despite her injuries. The insurgent attack had been defeated, and intelligence recovered from the textile factory provided valuable information about enemy operations. In the Fallujah area, the official after-action report praised Sarah's leadership and tactical decision-making throughout the engagement. Her choice to launch an offensive action when surrounded had disrupted insurgent plans and bought crucial time for the SEAL team to reach their position. The report noted that her personal courage and refusal to abandon wounded Marines had inspired her entire team to continue fighting against overwhelming odds. Sarah returned to duty 6 months later, though she would carry scars from her 14 wounds for the rest of her life. The textile factory in Fallujah was later destroyed in a controlled demolition, but Sarah's story became legendary among Marine units deployed to Iraq. Her example of leadership under impossible circumstances continues to be studied at military academies and leadership schools. Years later, Sarah would say that the battle in Fallujah taught her that survival often depends not on superior firepower or numbers, but on the refusal to give up when everything seems hopeless. Her 14 wounds were a testament to the price of leadership in combat, but her decision to hold her position until the SEALs arrived saved the lives of every Marine under her command. The dusty streets of Fallujah had witnessed many battles, but few demonstrated the power of individual courage and determination as clearly as Sarah's fight in the textile factory during that sandstorm in 2004.